Let's talk Dusty Automata, Scheming Sorcerers, and Mutant Zangors with a tier list of strongest and weakest Thousand Sons units in Warhammer 40k 10th. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Thousand Sons, and in this video I thought we'd go through the codex with an overview of each and every unit, and talk about roughly how strong they are and how they might fit in competitive lists. At the moment I'd say that Thousand Sons are in a fairly good place in Warhammer 40k 10th edition right now. Initially in the first big index drop, they were one of the very most powerful armies in the game, perhaps somewhere in the top 5 with some combination of efficient damage dealers, plus some absolutely devastating Kabbalistic rituals. But in Games Workshop's first heavy balanced data slate, they basically hit a lot of the army's most competitive choices with medium-sized nerfs, though perhaps the overall effect hasn't really been too negative for them going forward, due to the way that a lot of things that were stronger than them getting hit harder. The big tournament win rate of the Thousand Sons seems actually to be fairly stable, staying around about 50% or so, and they have managed to take down around 3 big tournaments since the balanced data slate, which is certainly a lot more than most armies out there. In this video I thought I'd talk through a rough tier list of units in the army, ranking the squad's vehicles and characters into 4 different tiers of rough strength, starting with the lowest and ending with the highest, and saying why I've ranked them where I did. This one, as always, is made with a combination of what's commonly seen in tournament lists plus community polling, though obviously tier lists in Warhammer 40k are always just a bit arbitrary. Some things are going to be on the borderlines, and depending what your army and playstyle is, then certainly things in the lower tier could be far stronger, or vice versa. In any case, let's jump into it and talk through some of the strongest and weakest units in the codex. First up for tier 4, and unfortunately perhaps for standout weak units, I do feel that the Helldrake is maybe one of the least suitable Tzeentch units for the schemes at the moment. As with the other Chaos Codexes that can take them, they might have the speed to get exactly where they need to and can threaten a bit of melee, particularly against fly units, but in general the damage output that they can do just doesn't really match up with the enormous points cost that you pay at 195 points. The Tzeentch version of the Helldrake strips cover from one unit that's hit by its shooting attack. Not an awful rule in itself, but as with other places, not really worth it at 195 points. And in the context of the Thousand Sons army, I don't really feel like it's super powerful. They're not really just a dedicated gunline army that hoovers you off the board with shooting, at least not as much as some out there. Overall, I think it could probably just afford to be a little bit cheaper or a little bit more dangerous for its cost. Moving on to tier 3 datasheets that I consider a bit more underwhelming. Starting out with a Thousand Sons unique units, it's maybe not the best time to have loads of Goat Bird boys in game right now. It's 65 points for 10 of them, or 130 for 20. Toughness 4 with a 6+ invulnerable save, so at least are fairly sturdy as chaff infantry go, and they do have objective control too, still meaning that they are kind of usable chaff for just holding down points and taking a bit of enemy firepower. Their special rule allows them a 4+ chance to farm some more Cabal points if they're holding objectives in the command phase, but despite this, these are kind of rarely to never seen in competitive lists. Cheaper units like the Zangor Enlightened are often more used as grunt units, and for units to stand on objectives, Rubric Marines do seem to be the way that almost everyone seems to go, having a bit more threat, guarding the important characters, and also getting you more Cabal points as well. I think realistically though, a unit or two of Zangors isn't really something that you can go too far wrong with. They are quite expendable at 65 points, and toughness 4 means they're tougher to gun down than most out there. Not bad for sacrificial screens or just units to sit on home field objectives and rustle up a few more points. The Zangor Shaman I think is also in a kind of interesting place. 60 points for 5+ Feel No Pain and +1 to hit for a Zangor unit, and he can either lead the regular ones on foot or the Enlightened. He also has a little bit of shooting and melee of his own and farms 1 Cabal point, and I feel like he's in a weird case of actually giving genuinely quite good boosts for his points cost, but just awkwardly being in a place where it doesn't usually make sense to really build around Zangors that much. The damage output isn't terrible, but it's not really going to do much besides against lighter infantry. And if you're trying to make them more durable, then rather than having a Feel No Pain type save on the go, you're probably just better devoting the points dedicated to this guy to putting yet more units of Zangors on the board. He does at least come quite cheap though, and has a Cabal point as well as his buffs. Again, one of the ones that doesn't really get very many competitive selections, but I feel like isn't actually the worst sat on a unit of Zangors, heading for the midfield to be a little bit tougher and fightier, while also farming Cabal points. Next up, we've got the Thousand Sons Hellbrutes at 145 points. The Hellbrutes all have their own interesting special rules in the Chaos armies these days, and this guy's no exception. As well as the fairly standard profile he has, he farms Cabal points within 9 inches, getting to recycle 1 each time you use a Kabbalistic ritual within that range. If you did decide to keep your army together and have him somewhere towards the centre, that could be worth something like 2 or 3 points per turn, I suppose. Certainly not awful, but that does require having your army place some positioning restrictions on it, which might not be that helpful. I feel like one of their advantages is that you can pop off major powers anywhere all over the board. Say like an isolated sorcerer surprising the enemy with a massive doom bolt and taking down one unit they shouldn't be able to beat one-on-one. Beyond that though, his actual damage and defense just isn't really all that exciting compared with the other damage dealers and demon engines. If I was running one, I'd probably just take one and have it towards the centre of your formation to get those points back. Next up, we've got the Predator Annihilator and Predator Destructor, both 130 points now. And if you just want long-range anti-tank firepower, they're really not too bad for the cost. The Annihilator with its strength 14 twin-linked las cannon and the damage and re-rolling the damage rolls of 1 is fairly good damage output. Plus if you do take heavy bolters or combi bolters, then you get the Inferno versions of those. As with most of the demon engines though, it maybe just doesn't really play too well into the Thousand Sons core strengths with the sorcerers and the infantry buffs that you can get. Though having a little bit of dedicated anti-tank fire support I think really isn't the worst in the world. I'd probably put it towards the top of this tier, though I think a lot of people might be a bit more tempted by the Thousand Sons Forge Fiends. The Mauler Fiend is 155 points, who's a fairly hard-hitting melee monster. He's particularly good at taking down tanks and vehicles and really heavy big things. Maybe not too much to say about this guy, certainly fills a bit of a distraction Carnifex type role where the opponent will have to try and focus on him, otherwise he is going to make a mess of something. I feel like the Thousand Sons core rule that he gets though maybe isn't the most interesting one. He gets a 0 CP heroic intervention which is situational at best. I'd say in general he's still probably less exciting than the Mutalith overall with its big feel no pain type saves, okay melee and doing other interesting things with shooting and extending the range of the rituals. I think if I was going for a big mutant monster walker, I'd be a bit more tempted by that guy as the overall offering. Next up we've got the Thousand Sons Spawn. Again, for these guys, I don't really think they're all that bad if you want some chaff units. 65 points for 2 of them, and they get both a 5+ invulnerable save here and a 5+ feel no pain and regenerating wounds. It means they can be quite annoying for isolated enemy units to try and take them down. Between the invulnerable and the feel no pain, they are at least fairly tough for the cost, though if you want units to be skirmishing over objectives, then Zangors and Cultists will have more OC, and if you just want small fast moving nuisance units, then you might want the Zangor Enlightened instead. Finally, to round out the Thousand Sons motor pool at this level, the Vindicator is 190 points. Really quite big hitting Thousand Sons firepower, but at a cost. Again, like the Predator Annihilator, I'd say its anti-tank damage really isn't too bad for the points, though given just how much of an investment this one is, I feel like its defense isn't actually that great for the cost, despite sporting a 2+ save with that Siege Shield. The Defiler I'd probably put towards the lower end of this tier. The numbers just don't really work out for them quite as well against some of the other options in 10th edition, I think. It is a fairly generalist walker that does have a range of guns that can deal with a lot of targets, plus the melee is really quite strong and good against heavy hitters, maybe similar to the Mauler Fiends. In general though, I feel like I'd rather go with Mutaliths or even the Mauler Fiends. A small points cut might be needed for the Defiler to compete better against them. Again, with the motor pool, you just sort of feel like you're not really playing into the main strength of the faction, particularly as the vehicles don't generate you any Cabal points at all. Moving onwards and upwards, in tier 2 we've got the datasheets that I'd rank in the middle tier for the Thousand Sons. Typically a few of these tending to see a bit more play in tournaments, but not in as great numbers or as with much regularity as the stuff that I've ranked top tier. The Zangor Enlightened at 45 points I think are really quite handy as a little utility unit, at least medium speed at 10-inch movement and 2 wounds apiece, and they get a reactive d6-inch movement which is quite nice for skirmishing in the midfield and trying to keep them safe from enemy attacks. Just having a unit that's 45 points cost only is really quite nice for cheap secondaries, or being nice expendable trading units that you could throw out to an objective and force the opponent to come and deal with them. The damage output isn't super exciting, but they can chip in a little bit with those Fake Caster Great Bows or the Divining Spears, and say they're a unit that I'm kind of borderline between putting on tier 2 or tier 1. I think it's pretty handy to have 1 or 2 units of them in an army, but you probably don't want to go too heavy on the chaff units. Speaking of other auxiliary supports, I'd also rank the Thousand Sons Cultist here, really quite cheap chaff for objectives with a few special weapons so they can at least contribute at range a bit more than the Zangors, and interestingly enough they come preloaded for a 1 command point if the unit dies that you get on a 2+. Again, I'd kind of rank these with the Zangor Enlightened, the regular Zangors, and maybe the Chaos Spawn. You probably want some very cheap expendable chaff units in the army, but you don't want to go too heavy on them. I feel like the Cultists are an interesting enough choice for sacrificial units to head towards the midboard. If they manage to stand on an objective for a good part of the game, then they've probably earned your victory points back there. If the opponent does move out to kill them, then hopefully they've had to reposition and you can strike them back after losing something that's not very valuable. And if they do die, then they've just generated you a command point, which when they're only 60 points to start with, I think is genuinely a biggish part of their value. Realistically though, I feel like they're not all that far ahead of Zangors for their role. The Zangors do get a toughness 4 and a 6+ invulnerable save to make them tougher. They're objective control too, and it's not really like they cost much different. Next up, for 75 points, we've got the Rhino. Pretty cheap and effective, and very usable. A nice little tank to get your Rubric Marines from A to B, maybe backed up by some Infernal Masters, perhaps one firing out of the top hatch. Compared with other factions' Rhinos, I don't feel like the Thousand Suns one does too badly. Getting 2 Inferno Combi Bolters plus a Havoc Launcher are quite nice overall. It could be surprisingly worrying against lighter squads of enemy infantry. In general, they're not considered like they need to be spammed in big numbers by most people. You may be only having 1 or 2 in an army list, but overall I feel like they're a pretty reasonable way from getting Rubric Marines onto midfield objectives, perhaps nice to deliver a Warp Flamer squad or Infernal Master shooting in particular. Next up, for firepower choices, the Forge Fiend is 135. Out of any of the Thousand Suns vehicles, I feel like this one might be one of the most tempting for fire support. It is quite a lot cheaper than the other Chaos Space Marine Forge Fiends, and while it doesn't get the lethal or critical hits from the Dark Packs that the vanilla Chaos Space Marine version does, it does actually have a good special rule where it's suppressing the foe for a -1 to hit, and that's really quite nice to have just thrown into your biggest and most dangerous enemy unit. Limiting their damage output the next turn will definitely have some value above what this guy can do. Otherwise, just for 135 points, it's got OK defense, it gets an invulnerable save which the Predator tanks don't, and for its damage it gets 3 Exoplasma Blasts. The strength 10 and the damage 3 means that it's a threat to medium vehicles, and having triple blasts on the go means that you could be getting an extra 12 shots against a big ranked up horde of enemy infantry. Overall, between all that, I feel like if you want some dedicated fire support, then this guy really isn't the worst one to go for. Finally, we've got the Demon Princes, which I thought we'd talk about together, seeing as they're sort of similar in role. Though in reality for the Thousand Suns, I'd rank the standard one on foot at 180 points as quite a lot superior to the winged one at 195. The foot one actually helps out the rest of the army a bit, giving you an aura of stealth so you can have -1 rubrics or scarabs moving up the board perhaps. Then perhaps a surprisingly relevant once per game aura of getting your units to have precision attacks. That could be kind of lethal if you just have one of your big scary psychic snipery type units just take out an enemy character in the midst of a formation that they usually wouldn't be able to. Otherwise he fights at least fairly hard and it isn't the worst with defense, maybe not so unreasonable to have in the middle of the army perhaps. The winged one I'd say is maybe a bit more niche. It's definitely faster and it gets a mortal wound sweep attack if it can manage to move over enemies, and then its special rule is jumping on and off the board. I guess that could be helpful for certain secondaries and things, like maybe behind enemy lines or getting into the corners, though you are paying a lot of points if you're just going to be using the unit to do that. As a result, I'd be a bit more tempted to put the winged prince towards the bottom of this tier, or maybe higher tier 3. Just feels like neither of its special rules really synergize with what it wants to do, as if it's coming in via deep strike it's probably not going to be making the charge unless you get lucky. Finally, we get into top tier stuff though, and these are the units that I consider currently the strongest units in Index Thousand Suns. Out of their iconic rubrics and sorcerers is perhaps surprisingly balanced at the top I think. Most choices do tend to be really quite playable. I think it's kind of hard to start with anyone but Magnus, who's 440 points and does seem to be the linchpin of the vast majority of competitive army lists. Far more armies tend to use Magnus that do well in Thousand Suns than choose to leave him at home despite his massive price tag. He definitely does a lot for the army. He's got an enormous aura of +1 to hit and wounds for psychic attacks, kind of big with all the cult of magic buffs to psychic shooting that you can get. He's got huge personal damage with brutal psychic attacks of his own that get the +1 to wound, and then strong psychic melee, again with +1 to wound to follow that up. It's really quite fast to get him where he needs to go, and then he's got the choice of some other buffing rules. Typically I'd go for the -1 defense if he's going to be taking damage, though there are other options. On top of that, being such an enormous investment and massively dangerous unit, he's a particularly good one to combo the Kabbalistic rituals with, or using any focal stratagems like the rerolls for psychic damage. You're often going to get great value out of him there. Probably the biggest weakness is that despite the high toughness 2+ save and the -1 damage and things, his defensive stats per the amount of points that you pay just really aren't that great. You really don't want him getting gunned down too early, as that could be disastrous. The other absolute staple of just about every single Thousand Sons competitive list are the Rubric Marines, 105 points per 5 of them, 210 points per 10. They did go up a bit since the index release. They're perhaps most commonly used in units of 5 to bodyguard all the excellent sorcerers that we're about to get onto. But 10 strong units are used as good targets for focal buffs, maybe things like a big strike team of warp flamers that are teleporting across the board with the umbrellific crystal, or making particularly good use of stratagems or a focal character buff. Out of the Inferno Bolters or the Warp Flamers, I feel like they're both usable. I'd probably be more tempted by the Warp Flamers overall, as despite their short range, their damage output is just significantly more savage, and they can threaten some massive overwatch as well. I do quite like the Soul Reaper cannons as well. They get a lot of good attacks at a fairly good range, and they've got quite a nice special rule as well that allows you to reroll wound rolls when they target things that are on objectives. That is quite nice for clearing enemies off points. In general, the vast majority of competitive Thousand Sons lists right now are going very heavy on the Rubric Marines, usually somewhere between 20 to 40 of them. They perhaps do feel like a unit that's just somewhat necessary though, as you do kind of need to use them, as otherwise most of the cast of good sorcerers wouldn't really function very well. Next up, we've got the other big commitment unit that are the Scarab Occult Terminators, 215 points for 5 of them and 430 for 10 of them. These guys can just be an enormous focal damage and defensive type unit. Realistically, if you're fielding them, you're probably going to be taking a Terminator Sorcerer along for the ride, and that makes them all -1 to wound, so they are really quite tanky. And if you do go full on Thousand Sons Wombo combo with their Inferno Bolts and making them psychic and things, if you have them with some stratagems and Kabbalistic rituals and Magnus nearby, you basically create an enormous damage hammer that can just blast the vast majority of enemy units straight off the board in one round of shooting, and it does feel kind of silly and powerful for bolt weapons. That is enormous investment in both points and resources though. With their Deep Strike you could make use of Rapid Ingress, or you could use the Dark Matter Crystal, both of which could be good ways to get around their fairly slow movement and get them to where they need to be. And overall I think they're a very solid unit, though at least in more recent times they're definitely nowhere near as ubiquitous as Rubric Marines on the tournament scene. They seem to be a big choice that you can either go for in style or maybe just leave at home completely. Certainly if you're going for a 10-man unit backed up by a sorcerer, that's going to take a whole load of points away from anything else you might have wanted in the army. For that reason I've ranked them probably lower down tier 1, but still a solid choice. From there we get to the sorcerer units, where I think the Games Workshop has actually done really quite well to basically make them surprisingly well balanced. For the 5 different flavours of regular sorcerer character, I feel it's quite nice that none of them really stick out as particularly unusable or particularly overpowered and auto-include, though I'm sure different players have their preferences. Ahriman is 130 points or 140 points on disc. He gets you a big 3 Cabal points, so definitely a big force on the table for that. And his big special rule is that once per game he can use a Kabbalistic ritual completely for free. Maybe most reliable value from things like stripping saves from a key enemy unit, which usually cost loads of Cabal points, or just firing off an extra Doom Bolt, which is extra mortal wounds. Beyond that, he's also got a sniping ranged attack and damage 3 melee, and he also gives the unit that he's leading a +1 to wound as well, which is a fairly respectable damage boost, particularly for things like Warp Flamers. Next up, we've got the regular sorcerer on foot for 95 points. His damage boost is a nice simple lethal hit, but it's perhaps his other special rule that's really quite interesting. The unit that he's leading can't be shot outside of 18 inches, meaning that he could be a pretty good choice to be with a Rubric Marine unit on an outlying primary objective, or maybe back on a home field primary. Does mean that the unit can be very safe unless the enemy can get nice and close. He does get some infantry killing psychic shooting, though he does only generate you 1 Cabal point, which is maybe a bit of a weakness compared with some of the rest. Next up there's the Exalted Sorcerers, 100 points for the regular one or 115 for the disc one. They both give you a 4+ invulnerable save for your Rubric unit, which is nice for keeping them nice and durable on the objectives, maybe not the worst to have on the front lines. A psychic shooting is kind of similar, with either an Astral Blast attack or a torrent version with the Arcane Fire with the disc one. The regular one revives slain Rubric Marines, and the disc one gets to slow down a unit within 18 inches and hopefully disrupt their advance. Out of the two I might be a little bit more tempted by the regular one, though I have seen some people playing around with the disc version, messing with enemy movement and having big torrent attacks. Both are really quite nasty. They could be particularly good choices for Rubric Marines that are trying to take the midfield, perhaps due to the 4+ invulnerable save. Next up, for the big damage dealer, we've got the Infernal Master at 90 points. He grants the unit sustained hits, and also gives you a nice boost to allow you to flip an attack dice or a save to a 6 each turn, so basically guaranteed extra defense for your unit, and guaranteed extra hits or wounds, both of which are really quite nice boosts. He does come with a particularly savage flame type attack though. 2d6 strength 6 AP2 damage 1 torrent attacks is really going to be felt by the vast majority of infantry out there. And particularly combined with some warp flamers, it means that he's a pretty massive overwatch threat. He could certainly take down a bunch of space marines. Could be a kind of nice one to have blazing away with that torrent firepower out of a rhino perhaps as he gets into battle. And again seems like a pretty reasonable sorcerer type choice to have on the front line. Finally, and I guess only really relevant if you're taking the Terminator squad, is the Thousand Sons Terminator Sorcerer. He gives you lethal hits for Scarab Occult Terminators, which is definitely no bad thing if he's buffing a massive unit of 10 of them. That is going to add up to a whole load of extra damage, never mind also triggering the -1 to wound roll, so making them quite a lot tougher as a result. Then he also gets to mark 1 unit for reroll hit rolls of 1 against them for your entire army, so quite a nice damage boost there for other focal shooting or psychic damage. And a nice and fairly generous psychic attack with a few shots to take down space marines, but it also has anti-vehicle and anti-monster as well, so at least he chips in against bigger stuff a bit more than most. Overall, between all that, I think he brings some pretty solid value to the unit. Effectively 3 fairly major buffs there, plus his own damage that he brings as well. I think he's a very tempting choice if you're taking a Scarab Occult unit of any size. Lastly, for the core Thousand Sons unit, we've got the great big tentacled horror that is the Mutalith Vortex Beast. I feel like maybe the initial shine of this one came off a little bit with the points rise, where previously I might have ranked it as one of the single most strong monsters or vehicle units in the game, but I still think that he's very playable just for some raw might in the middle of the army at 165 points. A 5+ invulnerable save and a 5+ feel no pain means that you'll have to chew through quite a lot of wounds to take one down. He's got some fairly big and fairly flexible shooting damage, with a ruinous anti-tank shot that could just one-shot a vehicle if you roll well, a bunch of mid-strength damage for melee that would make a mess of elite infantry and terminators, and a helpful boost to Kabbalistic rituals that I think will come in handy. You get to double the range of them for units within 6 inches. Overall, pretty good stuff overall, I think. I haven't really seen many people spamming, say, 3 of them, like a few people did towards the start of the edition, but might be nice to have 1 or 2 seized in the formation as a big annoying threat to move up in the centre of the board that's going to soak a lot of firepower or cause some carnage. Finally, and not really Thousand Sons units, but I'd definitely be considering a certain few friendly demons to help out if you wanted some annoying units. For ally choices, Thousand Sons could ally either Chaos Knights or anything from the Tzeentch section of the Chaos Demon Codex. It seems that currently perhaps the most popular choices in top performing competitive lists are some annoying lone operatives, typically either the Blue Scribes or the Changeling. The Blue Scribes don't really do much, but the Changeling has got a couple of disruptive type rules for enemy shooting. The main reason that they get taken though is just literally to be fairly cheapish and annoying lone operatives that are quite handy for doing secondaries and things. Kind of handy to have lone operatives that can just deep strike anywhere on the table, and particularly ones with quite good movement characteristics like the Blue Scribes. Basically choices that could be taken to rival some of the Thousand Sons chaff units. Not much objective control, but also not being shot out at 12 inches is a big advantage for that kind of role. So with the top tier stuff talked about, that is the end of our Thousand Sons tier list. Let me know what you make of it down in the comments below. Would you have ranked these any differently, and which units have been performing the best for you on the tabletop at the moment? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. I'm sure we'll have more for the Thousand Sons in the future. Otherwise, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.